We'll call the meeting to order, and we're dealing with the order reference dealing with Bill C-44, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 22nd. I apologize to witnesses for the delay, but the way we will try and proceed, we'll go this panel 1 hour, the next panel 1 hour. To start, we have with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Mr. Sanger, Senior Economist. Toby, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to say at the outset that I welcome this government's promise in the election and in the ministerial mandate letters to establish the Canadian Infrastructure Bank to provide low-cost financing for new municipal infrastructure projects. I also strongly welcomed the promise to set a high bar for openness and transparency in government, and the promise to stand up for and strengthen the middle class and those working hard to join it. I was very happy to hear the Prime Minister say that they'd end the undemocratic practice of using omnibus bills to prevent Parliament from properly reviewing and debating proposals. And this is why I and others, I think, are so disappointed in these plans for the Infrastructure Bank in Bill C-44. It represents broken promise after broken promise after broken promise. Right from the outset, it won't provide low-cost financing for municipalities. That was the promise in the election campaign and also in the ministerial mandate letters. Instead, the priority has shifted to leveraging higher-cost private sector capital. In a recent report that I wrote, I demonstrated how the higher cost of private sector finance could mean that these projects could cost twice as much. And no one has disputed those figures. In fact, people have said that the rate of return on the private sector side is larger than that. This means that we'll get half as much bang for our buck in terms of infrastructure, less infrastructure, not more. The bank won't be open, transparent, or accountable to Canadians. The Federal Auditor General has limited power to review the operations of Crown corporations, and less so than with direct public projects. This legislation also threatens anyone who discloses information about projects relating to proponents with a $10,000 fine and 6 months in jail. Investments are supposed to be in the public interest, but the legislation bars officials from being on the board. It won't help strengthen the middle class and those working hard to join it. Yes, jobs will be created from infrastructure investments, but many more could be created if the money went to construction and employment and not to higher financing costs. Higher user fees associated with these projects will hurt middle and working classes the most. They'll also be bad for the economy, taking money away from other spending. The bank was designed, as we found out, that it was designed by a small privileged group of financiers who stand most to benefit from it, including BlackRock Inc., the biggest asset manager in the world, which recently hired top civil servants. As others have said, if this isn't a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. The infrastructure and Prime Minister say they consulted with unions and others, but we know that the design for this came from the Finance Minister's Economic Advisory Council, which is dominated by CEOs. And it's also included in a budget omnibus bill. Another concern is that the bank also won't help with the type of comprehensive national infrastructure planning that we need. Instead, private interests that dominate it will focus on what will maximize their private profits. And allowing it to entertain unsolicited proposals will mean that they'll also cherry-pick public assets to privatize for the greatest profit. It'll result in a patchwork of privatized projects driven by no other logic than private profiteering off public infrastructure. And the initial $35 billion in federal public funding will just pave the way for this. Now, I was very surprised to hear the Finance Minister say yesterday that Cabinet would approve projects, because from my reading of the legislation, I think most others, that's not the case. So instead, the government should do what they promised and what Canadians voted for: establish a public infrastructure bank that provides low-cost financing, and that means public financing for new municipal infrastructure projects. There's no shortage of financing available for the Government of Canada to borrow at low interest rates. And if this was done through a public bank and lending institution like the Business Development Bank of Canada or CMHC or EDC, then its investments and borrowing wouldn't need to increase the deficit or net debt any more than the current proposal. It should, number two, it should also ensure much stronger accountability, transparency and review by Auditor Generals, by the bank and its projects, should provide full public disclosure of all details and business cases, value for money assessments and contracts. You should also have public officials on the board so it acts in the public interest. We should ensure that public infrastructure projects remain public and aren't secret deals. And it should also establish a public and transparent process using evidence-based analysis for truly objective project planning of what should be the priority public infrastructure projects across the country. So we should use this type of proposal to engage in really, truly national, sensible national infrastructure planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sanger. You did call it as you've seen it. From the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, Mr. Kan, who's the director, and Mr. Bartlett, who's chief economist, who's on deck. Mr. Kan.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair, Vice Chairs, and members of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. It is an honor to be with you today. J'offrirai de brefs commentaires sur le projet.
I will make a few comments on Bill C-44, especially comments on Canada's essential infrastructure,
of which I am the Director of Performance, and my colleague Randall Bartlett is the Chief Economist, recently published a piece on assessing the risks and opportunities associated with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. The key premise underlying our piece is that a national infrastructure plan and strategy supported by evidence is required. This should be the first priority. Notre travail à cet égard nous a permis d'identifier trois éléments.
Our work allowed us to identify three key elements that are the basis of the steps needed to draft a work plan and a national strategy for essential infrastructure.
Stock needs to be addressed. Specifically, is this stock delivering or on track to deliver the benefits expected from them at the time they were approved? A report by the UK's National Audit Office highlighted the cost and challenges of delivering major projects in government, with the number of recurring issues affecting performance. Of the 149 major projects in the UK as of June 2015, with the total life cycle cost of £511 billion, successful delivery of 34% was considered to be in doubt or unachievable unless action was taken. Infrastructure investments alone are not a guarantee of infrastructure outcomes. La deuxième étape est de mener une analyse stratégique.
The second step is to do a strategic analysis of Canada's future infrastructure needs.
Social and environmental benefits expected of infrastructure investments. It would consider factors such as demographic trends, population growth, current and projected economic activity, trade corridors and future drivers of economic growth, the environment, and any significant regional variations in need. Finally, by understanding the condition of our current infrastructure stock and our future needs, we can identify what our infrastructure gap is relative to the future infrastructure needs. This is the evidence base, at a minimum, that we feel is needed to develop a national infrastructure plan and strategy. Currently, estimates of the national infrastructure gap in Canada range from $0 to $1 trillion. While estimates always come with some uncertainty, this is a wide range by any measure, and not one on which to build a national infrastructure strategy. Il est impératif de comprendre où nous en sommes.
It is imperative to understand where we are now and where we are going. Only then can a roadmap be prepared to get us to our destination.
Does identify an ambitious data initiative on Canadian infrastructure to provide the intelligence to better direct infrastructure investments. Further, the Budget Implementation Act does identify the collection and dissemination of data to monitor and assess the state of infrastructure in Canada as one of the functions of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. In our view, the data initiative identified in Budget 2017 and the function given to the Canada Infrastructure Bank is precisely what is required first and foremost to have an evidence-based national infrastructure plan and strategy. Details on this initiative are to be announced in the coming months, and we are very much looking forward to understanding the details and timelines expected of this initiative. Let us develop the plan first and then put in place the right strategies and instruments, such as the Infrastructure Bank, that are tailored to best achieve that plan. Ces initiatives sont...
Unfortunately, these initiatives are in the wrong order. We're putting the cart before the horse.
Look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Can. Mr. Dashis with the C.D. Howe Institute. Welcome. Floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Benjamin Dacus. I'm Associate Director of Research at the C.D. Howe Institute. We're a national, nonpartisan public policy think tank. And I'll be summarizing some of my recently published research that's available on the C.D. Howe Institute website. I've also brought copies for anyone interested, and some work that we're going to be publishing by Steve Robbins of Harvard University next month. The key message from our work is that the government's move to create an infrastructure bank is very much a step in the right direction. And it's now time to get the details right. We think that the bank requires independent governance, a deep commitment to evidence-based decision-making, and less political involvement in negotiating with potential private sector and local and provincial government partners. But first of all, it's really important to remember the benefits of using private investment in place of taxpayer-supported debt. Government funding for infrastructure has two hidden costs on the economy. First is greater risk on the taxpayers, and second is the economic harm of taxation. Now, one of the common arguments that you're going to hear favoring government infrastructure investment is lower borrowing rate compared to pretty much everyone else. Sounds like the government should do the borrowing, right? Well, not so fast. All this lower borrowing rate is a result of lenders viewing taxpayers as the guarantors of any cost overrun or late delivery. Sharing risk with institutional investors instead can be a better deal for everyone. Second, every taxpayer dollar the government uses for infrastructure has to come from someone's taxes. And those taxes mean some businesses don't make an investment and some people work less. And governments can reduce the economic harm of this by relying on users instead to pay for infrastructure rather than taxpayers, with institutional investors providing the financing in place of governments. So that's the case for private investment in infrastructure. The question now is, how do we do it right? First of all, where necessary, Ottawa and the provinces should be creating independent regulatory bodies overseeing infrastructure assets to ensure that their owners, either governments or private institutional investors, act in the public interest and for long-term sustainability. But importantly, that should not be the role of the bank. Our forthcoming work is going to point to a number of key design elements of the proposed infrastructure bank. So first, on governance. The bank should have a single objective in its mandate, clearly defining what projects the bank should pursue. Its independence should be enshrined in legislation in a way that protects it from day-to-day political influence, and it should have an independent board with fixed terms. Second, the federal government is going to need to create standardized project planning and create consistent cost, benefit, and risk metrics. And it should also require the collection of this data for all projects receiving federal funding and having more than, say, $100 million in capital costs. And Budget 2017's commitment to better data collection in infrastructure is definitely a positive step in this direction. And finally, for the bank's analysis to be viewed as credible, rigorous, and fact-based, it must be seen as independent of the political needs of the government of the day. Australia's experience with Infrastructure Australia is very instructive. When it was first established, it operated with a board with limited independence, and even had members from government departments on the board. And that discouraged states there and municipalities to participate. They saw the bank as insufficiently independent. And in 2014, the Australian federal government amended its mandate to create a truly independent board to address the concerns of states and municipalities. Board members there can now only be replaced for cause, and 1/4 are appointed on advice of other levels of government. Now, statutory independence means that the minister may not give direction to the bank on the content of any analysis, nor require the bank to proceed with projects with negative net benefits. Now, any initial deployment of public resources should be approved by the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities or together with Cabinet. That's absolutely needed to have the appropriate level of democratic oversight. But that kind of ministerial approval should happen at the very beginning of the process. Once the bank begins to procure with private or other government partners, the bank should have the ability to proceed to close the transaction without further ministerial approvals. And that will ensure market confidence in the procurement process. In sum, the government's proposal for an infrastructure bank is an excellent idea if done correctly. The broad strokes of a good proposal are under legislation. More institutional safeguards are necessary. The best way to do so is an important question for this committee to consider as it investigates this bill. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Turning then to Mr. Mahan with the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario.
Yes, thank you, Chair Easter, Vice Chairs, and members of this committee. My name is Andy Manahan. I'm the Executive Director of the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario, and I've been in that position for about 11 years. Obviously, we are a provincial association, so this is a rare opportunity for me to speak in Ottawa, and I really appreciate this. One of the things that's different about our organization is that we're a labour management organization. I'm not aware of any other across Canada that has both contractor associations and construction unions. So our members will be the ones that will be building some of the projects through the Canadian Infrastructure Agency or other infrastructure funding programs that are already in existence or may come in the future. I should say right off the top that we did commission a report independently about 2009, and it did recommend an infrastructure bank, but it didn't flesh it out. So when we heard in 2015 that the Ottawa government was contemplating an infrastructure bank, we decided to commission a report, and we actually used the infrastructure bank phrase. And that particular report resulted in a roundtable where the Deputy Infrastructure Minister and an ADM or Assistant Deputy Minister from Ontario and many other bright lights, including Ben and others, participated in this roundtable to hash it out. And I should say there was certainly not a unanimous position that this is the way to go, but overall we thought that if it was done correctly, the bank or agency would have a lot of merit. As a result of that roundtable, we commissioned Maddie Simiateki, who will be here later this afternoon, to talk about and provide more detailed recommendations on how this organization could be operationalized. And so I'll let Maddie talk more detail about that. I want to keep it very simple in terms of what I think are, and our organization thinks are some of the key roles of this agency. And I think project evaluation that we've heard from Ben is a critical function. I did look very briefly, I just got the KPMG report yesterday that talked about various things like the infrastructure funding gap or the deficit across Canada. And to my mind, you know, some people are still using the $123 billion deficit, even though that figure is about 10 years old. Some of the infrastructure modeling work that we have done is agent-based modeling, and it looks at it from a different perspective. Rather than how deep the hole is, what are we spending on infrastructure in relation to the GDP? So currently across Canada, we're at 3.1% GDP. An optimal point from a macroeconomic point of view would be 5%. So it's an aspirational target. I think where you want to get into what the dollar amounts are is when you get to local or regional level budgets. But I find that using those sorts of assumptions in terms of, you know, engineering, full replacement, or other aspects like that, it's not very helpful. So I would suggest that the big boy kind of consulting firms, management consulting firms, get off that track about talking about how big the deficit is, because it doesn't really help us. So while there exists a large infrastructure gap, there is likely a long list of projects that meet criteria such as socially and environmentally important. But how do we determine the best sequence of projects amongst so many worthy projects? So I think we could probably all, across your ridings, come up with projects that are really good right now, but I think it's critical that we also look at projects that have a positive ROI, return on investment, from a variety of perspectives. Secondly, I want to talk about, and I think Maddie will get into this as well, but it's really important that projects generate revenues. And I know this is sometimes politically toxic in terms of things like road pricing or tolling. But gas tax revenues are declining. We've seen that in the U.S. with respect to the highway trust funds, both federally and locally. It's probably not as severe in Canada, but we're heading in the same direction because cars are becoming more fuel efficient. There's more electric vehicles. So there has to be a transition. So when I heard, I think it was in May of 2016, where the finance minister talked about bold ideas and policy approaches, I'm thinking now about we're getting into an era of connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, more electric vehicles, and that's really going to link together very nicely, I think, with road pricing. So what's happening in the States, and I just found out about this on Friday at a conference I was at, but there are 14 western U.S. states that are looking at how do we transition from gas taxes to road pricing. And it's an experiment without any real dollars. It's sort of like a monopoly money game, but they have over 5,000 participants in this voluntary program, and they're trying to figure out what's going to happen. So the results aren't out yet, but I think this is something that we need to watch in terms of the SMART Committee's initiatives that are happening in the U.S. and now here in Canada. I did want to mention this, that one of the reasons Ben made some of the points that he did about the independence is that sometimes politicians do things which send out really negative signals. So from my mind, during the 2015 campaign, when a decision was made that the Champlain Bridge was not going to be tolled, in my mind, that's something that sends out a negative signal that, you know, can we count on revenues in the future? And I can give you many other examples, but the one I wanted to highlight is the Scarborough Subway extension. And the agency that had done the business case analysis for that alignment looked at it and said light rail transit is the way to go because of the former mayor of Toronto, Ford, and the popularity of that gentleman and the premier of the day, and then the connection of Ford to former Prime Minister Harper and Finance Minister Flaherty. All of a sudden a political decision was made despite the best evidence that we needed to build a subway, which has now turned into a one-stop subway. So our members are probably going to build that, we're going to benefit, but quite frankly, if you have an LRT with more stops, at each stop, you're going to have residential construction. So how would you do an innovative finance on that? Value capture. So there's a lot of creative things that get hurt when there's that kind of negative political interference. I'm not saying it's across the board, but I just want to provide those examples. And with respect to governance, that's probably the overarching important issue out of all of this. So Metrolinx had a situation where its president and CEO, I think, was put in a position of conflict because he had to report both to the Metrolinx board of directors and to his political masters at Queen's Park. So if he had that independence, he probably would have been more forceful in saying LRT or light rail transit is the way to go. So I won't belabor that, but I think you get where I'm coming from. So is this an extreme example? No, I think that you know, even with further evidence that you've probably all heard of, that ridership numbers are not as high as it should be, the costs continue to rise and are exorbitant, there seems to be no course correction on this particular thing. So I think that as the agency evolves, there should be not a go slow approach, but there should be an approach that looks at specific sectors. So should it be trade and transportation or transit? Should we look at water in the future for those communities that have full cost pricing or conservation oriented pricing? Yes. Do we need to look at green energy transmission? Yes. So there's lots of different ideas, but I think to ensure that we're successful as we roll this program out, we need to take those sort of evolutionary steps. And I'll end it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manahan. Just a question to committee before we go to questions, and we'll go to 5-minute rounds. Because of the delays in the House today due to tributes and other matters, that is really going to run us late tonight to the fact that we probably can't do the witnesses for Part 4 divisions that aren't done yet. The question is, when do we do it? We have 2 panels tomorrow afternoon. We have 2 panels Thursday afternoon. We could do them before we start on the bill on May 29th, but we're already going till 9 o'clock that night, so we crunch ourselves for time. Would it be possible to do the divisions on Thursday morning? We okay with that?
The 29th anyways, what does it matter if we sit another 30 minutes that night?
It might be longer than 30 minutes because one of those witnesses is there's service fees, which there's already 3 or 4 people on the question list. There's the Infrastructure Bank, and I believe there's the Invest in Canada. So they're could be lengthy. If we meet on Thursday morning, then if we have to meet on the 29th, we can, but I don't think we can do a thorough hearing unless we do it Thursday morning.
Sounds good.
Thursday morning, okay? All right, so we'll inform those that we... sorry, folks, for the interruption. We'll go to 5-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome everyone. Excuse the delay today. Just 2 or 3 comments, and then I'll ask a quick question. I've heard some viewpoints on infrastructure. I'm very familiar in Ontario with the P3 model. I was on a bond desk for one of the major banks, and I understand how the financing works for P3 and the different models of build to operate and build, maintain, operate, and so forth. We're having the York Spadina subway extension come up to Vaughan. Starting in about a couple of weeks, we'll have a brand new hospital being built in the city of Vaughan, which is a P3 model. And ourselves, we have our government's put forward an historic plan to invest over $180 billion in infrastructure over the next 12 years. And a saying that I've heard and that struck me as important is progress over process, is that we want to get projects built. And we don't want to chat about them for a long time. And I think that's been one of the causes of the infrastructure gap or deficit, and however you want to measure it and whatever relative means you want to measure it by. And this progress over process is basically getting the shovels going and as quickly as possible. So when I attack back to the Infrastructure Bank, and I say to me, this is one tool to accelerate and to broaden A, the infrastructure build, and B, the capital that's going to be utilized to build this infrastructure. And that's the way I humbly look at it. And I understand the importance of governance, evidence-based decision-making for the projects. But the idea is a very powerful idea. I applaud our government for putting it forward. I applaud our government for having the flexibility in governing to look at this mechanism in addition to the other models out there in Canada. And I applaud ourselves for looking at process, but looking at progress more importantly. So quick question too on the C.D. Howe Institute. When you look at infrastructure build out, the role that private capital can play is very powerful. I'd like for you to comment on that, please.
Yeah. So when it comes to the importance of private investment, it can't be emphasized enough that the public debate here misses the really core benefit, which is that transfer of risk. We in Canada, when we have public procurement, when you have entirely led by the public sector, a good example is the York University subway extension in Toronto, where projects like this go massively over budget and are severely delayed. Guess who's on the hook for that? When you have the public leading the procurement, taxpayers at the end of the day pay the costs. When you move to a model where you have private finance, we have that kind of risk sharing, the risks of the project don't go away. The key, though, is that it's not taxpayers who have to pay pay the bill. And this goes to the very key importance of making sure that, in Minister Sohi's words, we're investing in shovel-worthy, not just shovel-ready projects. It's really important to be picking the right projects and just rushing ahead to get things built without putting in place a proper business plan, which the private sector can help with in establishing what makes some sense, because a private investor is going to have to do a lot of due diligence on projects. All these sorts of things are really important for making sure that we're getting the best bang for a buck.
You get time for a very short question.
To Mr. Manahan, I'm not going to touch the politics of the Scarborough subway, so don't expect that. But I would like to get your comment on the governance, how important governance is in terms of getting the infrastructure mechanism bank in place correct.
Yes, I've read the recent media, about the sort of changing circumstances, and I think the view that we have is that true arm's length is much better than veto power or kind of recall or second guessing whether an evaluation was done correctly. So that's our view. Like you can do that with other kinds of infrastructure programs, but this bank should be sacrosanct that way.
Yep.
Both to
You're
Mr.
welcome.
Deltel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, messieurs, soyez les bienvenus dans à votre chambre.
I would like to welcome you to your House of Commons.
Would call the risk-taker situation that we have to address when we talk about this new bank. First of all, I would ask a question to Mr. Bartlett. We all know and we all recognize that when you invest in the private sector, you take the risk and you get the award or the reward. Enfin, les résultats, disons en français. But this is the key of the capitalism situation, risk-taker. In that case, we're talking about infrastructure, and so infrastructure, you cannot sell it somewhere else. This is built there, and this is for public purpose. So, can you explain us what is your vision of the risk-taker situation in the infrastructure bank, and which part, the people or the private investor, should take the risk?
Well, ultimately, if you are bringing the private sector into these sort of contracts and these arrangements, that risk should be transferred to the owner of that asset ultimately. So the private sector should be pricing into the contract and their risk-adjusted returns what the risks are to those investments, and that is both the risk on the return as well as the capital appreciation of the asset. So that is where you would expect the risk ultimately to be transferred as a share of the ownership. One of the concerns that we have in looking at the P3 model is that some of that risk is often not transferred to the private sector. So some of that return risk, some of that demand risk is still borne by the public sector, even with the intent of the transfer. So that's largely what the concern that we brought up in our recent piece was that our assets being correctly priced in that context when you're not actually getting the full transfer of the risk from the public to the private sector.
Mr. Daché, what is your thought about that? What are your thoughts?
I think that's correct. We have not in Canada moved our P3 model so far as to really take into account that demand risk. At the end of the day, most P3 projects in Canada, historical P3s and projects, we're starting to move a little bit more in this direction. Governments are at the end of the day, and taxpayers, by definition, are on the hook for demand not materializing. And what consistently happens is governments overestimate the potential demand for whether it's a transit line, whether it's a road, all these sorts of projects, and taxpayers are on the hook. But when you start bringing in private sector investors, they have a lot more incentive, to make sure that they're projecting demand more accurately, because otherwise it's their company on the line. Whereas in the public sector, you don't really have that kind of risk borne by an individual.
Okay. Mr. Harikani? What are your thoughts about that?
Mr. Bartlett articulated this as well. I mean, what we've found in terms of the transfer of risk, basically all the P3s in Canada have been justified on the basis that they're transferring risk to the private sector. We haven't been able to get the details on that because they keep that secret. That's a real concern on this. But when the Ontario Auditor General reviewed 74 P3s in Ontario, she found that there was not one shred of evidence for the risk that was being transferred, and that there was at least $3 billion of the risk that was double counted on that. So not one shred of evidence on that. So they're all justified on it. I could make up those numbers, that risk is being transferred. but the risk was not transferred. The other thing is that the private sector generally has only about 10 to 50% equity in it, and they assume a lot more risk is transferred. And then thirdly, another thing is that if these are public infrastructure projects, if they're delivering a public service, the public sector will be responsible, will feel the responsibility to keep those projects going. So if they go bankrupt, and just about all these projects, all P3s are set up as what they call SPVs, special purpose vehicles. So they're separate. There may be big companies behind them, but they're set up as limited liability corporations. They can walk away from it with very little. The people backing it can walk away from it with very little, with little at risk. And then who has to pick up the pieces to provide the service? It's a public sector if they want it to keep on operating. That's operated in a number of different places. So this whole idea about risk transfer, it's I don't think it has. I don't think there's a lot of credibility behind it. It's a real problem. Might sound good in theory, but in reality, it doesn't happen.
Thank you both, Mr. Massé.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. One of the things that's interesting is where I represent is an area that actually had a $1.4 billion P3, being the Herb Gray Parkway. We're in the process now of connecting it to border crossing, where we're going to do a P3 for an international border crossing, something that hasn't been done before for a bridge. But anyway, with the Herb Gray Parkway, and I'd be interested to get your comments on this in terms of risk assessment, it was a P3 where basically we had what was called girder gate. 500 girders had to be destroyed, 200 pulled from the ground and replaced because the private contractor in the P3 decided to make shortcuts and didn't do a proper welding. And interestingly enough, the reason this all became public was because one of the workers I met at the gym I actually go to. That led to the entire issue. And there was also other issues with non-compliance of payment, being the P3 main contractor would not pay local businesses and had to be issued into the court to do so. So local businesses that were supposedly guaranteed contracts, or at least some partial competitive work around the project, weren't paid for some work. And then lastly, there is some ongoing court costs that still are still being litigated. So with that, I'm describing a P3 process that does not seem to be unusual. I asked Mr. Sanger, and to go across, is that what do you think with regards to this P3 element? And the concern that I have is that we also add into it inefficiencies and extra costs that actually can take away from the fact that a design, build, and payback over a bonding system might actually provide an advantage to versus that of the profit margin that's added in for a P3.
I'd agree with you. You raise important concerns. I think one thing about the infrastructure bank proposal is that, and others have said that it'll be based on user fees as well. So increased user fees. A lot of the P3s that we have in Canada don't have the demand risk, and I think others have talked about that. But the idea behind these projects is that they will be revenue generating, so there will be user fees. That's going to really increase the cost on, as I mentioned, is really going to increase the cost on middle class Canadians. I just had to respond to this as well. And Ben Dackles talked about Infrastructure Australia. Well, what's happened in Australia is there's been so much privatization there that the former head of the Competition Bureau there has said that it's been bad for the economy because costs have risen on individuals there, and it's taken money away from other things. So it's been a very regressive measure on that. So I agree with you on the P3 side. It's been difficult, but there are real problems that I think people need to be concerned about increasing user fees. And that's one reason why the Premier of Ontario is in such low popularity right now, because of higher costs for hydro. So.
When it comes to P3 contracts specifically, I think in any contract between the public and private sector is what matters is how it's drafted and that the incentives are aligned properly between the two parties. And in the case that you're describing, it sounds like that very much wasn't the case. I mean, P3s that have been the most successful, when it comes, you need to have the private sector involved all through the process and in the operation and maintenance of it as well in order to make sure those incentives are aligned. Certainly, I'm sure they wouldn't have put in low quality girders if they knew they had to replace them every few years or something along those lines. So that's often been an issue in the P3 contracts as well, is that the operations and maintenance side of it has not been transferred to the private sector from the public.
It's important to note that 40,000 vehicles traverse this route, 10,000 trucks. It's odd that a sense that if that was the case in terms of the contract, it's 35% of Canada's daily trade with the United States, almost $1 billion a day, and we'd put all that at risk. And it's interesting that if it's the contract, so I guess any contract could be at risk. If there's one you wouldn't want to screw up, it would be this one.
Agreed. And this is one of our concerns around the CIB as well, is whether or not these deals will necessarily be structured properly in order to make sure that all of the parties' incentives are aligned to ensure that there's the best value for money for taxpayers in Canada. So I'll pass that to Ben.
We'll give you a
Yep.
30 seconds.
So the real quick question on the Herb Gray Parkway is who ended up paying for that mistake. But very quickly on user fees, the lack of user fees in Canada is why we can't have nice things. When it comes to the lack of, say, transit in Canada, congestion on our highways, we need to be able to have tolls and prices on these assets to make sure it's properly utilized. The lack of tolls is why we have congestion, and the bank's proposal to have revenue generation as part of it is an absolutely great innovation.
Thank you both. Mr. Ouellette. Oh, okay.
If there's a minute, sure. Because I'm familiar with that project. It was a foreign firm, a Spanish firm, and Minister Murray was the infrastructure transportation minister. Then when he heard about it, he was very strong in terms of getting those girders replaced. So obviously these things go through the courts. But what I wanted to mention, and that we're missing so far, and the Auditor General missed, is that if we're doing a true P3 project where it's design, build, finance, and maintain, they're going to be building it better from the beginning. It's going to be maintained better. So that's a really big difference. And the Auditor General, it was like apples and oranges. She completely missed that. So one of the things that our organization did, we were part of a team that met with Infrastructure Ontario after that particular situation. There were other examples of foreign consortia coming in, like the Spadina subway extension. And so this may not be the silver bullet, but we ensured that any future IO contracts had a 10% local weighting. So if you're a local firm, you have a slightly better chance of winning a bid. It helps.
Okay, we'll have to cut you there. Mr. Ouellette.
Thank you very much. One of my questions I'd like to ask about is the governance structure. So currently what we've proposed is a board of directors with a chairperson appointed by ordering council, governing council. And so I'd just like your opinion on that structure. Is it adequate? Should there be more oversight, less oversight on that? And you can go down the line if you like. We can end with you.
Okay.
Toby.
Up to me then. Well, I did provide some comments with respect to Metrolinx, so I think, separation of church and state is really important for this organization. It really bothers me that there will be an opportunity, for example, for the entire board to be pulled or something like that. That happened in Metrolinx around 2009-10 period. It was a primarily municipally based board. There were municipal politicians with one exception. And I think the province thought that they were going to do a wholesale change, so then it became a private sector board. In terms of Metrolinx, my view was at the time that a hybrid board would have been more effective. So you have some elected officials on a board, but with people on that board with specific expertise, whether it's accounting, engineering, transportation, you name it. Those sorts of people need to be represented on a really effective board.
Yeah, so right now the legislation has got the broad strokes right. So the real question now becomes, there are governance issues that need to be addressed. Should these governance issues be enshrined in the legislation? And there it's pretty, it's hard coded in. That will be hard to change in the future. or do you try to add these other governance issues through regulations or other institutional design issues with the bank? Just to give you one example, looking at Infrastructure Australia, its founding legislation specifies that the minister must not give directions about the content of any audit, list, evaluation, plan, or advice. And that kind of very definitive independence about the bank's independence is not in place right now with this proposal. So the question for the bank, for this committee becomes, do you recommend changes to legislation, which are going to slow things down, or do you want to be able to get this together quickly, but at the same time have risks of a lack of independence or perceived independence?
Mr. Gunn?
So with respect to our thoughts, we actually haven't even looked at the governance, to be quite honest, because our feeling is that we really need to do that strategic bottom-up needs assessment, really get to a good understanding of our current infrastructure stock and our infrastructure gap. So really, we think the infrastructure bank right now, it's really putting the cart before the horse. So we really haven't really looked at the governance right now, because we really think you need to get the evidence around how is our infrastructure currently performing, what are our strategic needs going forward, and once we've got that kind of a picture and a national infrastructure plan and strategy, we can really take a look at kind of the governance and what the design of the bank ought to be.
Very good question. I do. There's a lot of public money in this, $35 billion to start from the federal government. I think that there should be some representative of the public interest, not necessarily a politician, but a public official at the high level on this. If there's that money, I mean, that's just a start. We have to accept the fact that all of these projects are ultimately going to be paid for by the public, either through governments or through user fees. So there should be some public representation. Now, there are ways people get concerned about political interference and about various politicians, and you know, you're all elected, so there is a democratic angle on that. We shouldn't be critical of politicians in that way, but there is a way. But I think that you need to also look at the way that you can remove some of these projects from the inappropriate political, like creating the gazebo in Muskoka for the G7, that type of thing. The U.S. has got quite a good system in place that reduce that earmarking, and so you have that type of comprehensive planning that's based on evidence and that has got criteria for prioritizing projects in place. So it's connected to what Mr. Ali Khan was talking about, having that governance.
A very quick question.
Very quick question. Very quickly, everyone, not spending a long time explaining, what types of projects could you see this bank funding, and what would be appropriate?
Via rail expansion to higher speed rail between Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, for example.
I agree. Yeah, that's a good one.
It's actually a great example.
I would agree with that as well.
Yeah.
Totally
okay.
With the proper.
It's the mode. It's not necessarily the type of project, but my big concern is the higher cost of public finance or private finance that will pervert it.
Jeepers, I thought we were going to have unanimous agreement by witnesses at committee. Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Khan and Mr. Dux, by your comments, it seems like, if I can interpret what you're saying, is that we have before us here a budget bill, and stuck in the middle is this infrastructure agency. Would it seem to you, what I'm hearing from you is it seems like this shouldn't be part of the budget bill, should be a separate standalone, get it right, instead of sort of sticking it in the budget bill. Would either of you concur with that?
I'll start. Yeah. So actually, I think our viewpoint more is that not in terms of whether it's in the budget bill or it's not in the budget bill. We really feel that the most important initiative that we should do first and foremost is really getting the data and evidence around what the future. To
get this budget passed in 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. So in essence, are you not saying that get it right, so do it outside of the budget bill?
I guess you could say that in the sense that if getting it right means that it is actually helping to deliver on selecting the right projects that are going to help meet or reduce our infrastructure gap, then absolutely.
And I would say that I'm an economist and not a legislative drafter. The question becomes, how much of these institutional details have to be baked right into the legislation as opposed to what can come afterwards? And that's a question that, that Parliament and this committee will have to be asking.
I wanted to follow up on another discussion that took place earlier. But first of all, I'll admit my bias. I'm a big supporter of P3s. I'm a big supporter of the Canada P3 projects, or the concept that was out there under the Conservative government. I'm not familiar with what Mr. Massey was talking about. I am familiar with Alberta. But the P3, in my view, only works if it's a full design, build, operate, and maintain. And I think I heard a couple of indications along that line. So if this infrastructure agency is going to move forward, would that be one of the things that it should look at, is to not necessarily just go with the design build P3s, but ensure that it's the full package so that the taxpayer isn't on the hook. And if the private sector can't justify the full package, then should the government be putting in loan guarantees or other things that are being talked about?
Say that a long-term equity stake is exactly along the lines. A long-term equity stake as proposed in the sort of original framing in the back in the fall 2016 economic statement is exactly along the lines we were talking about, of a long-term operate and maintain role for institutional investors. So I very much see the idea of this infrastructure bank to get to that core issue that Andy mentioned of during construction. P3 providers may not be thinking long-term, but with an equity stake, they absolutely can be.
I would just add that the operating component isn't critical, the maintenance component is. And going back to the UK in the 1980s, when the train systems became privatized, there were agreements with the unions there that those folks would keep their jobs. So I think up to the point of maintain is important, but operations, and we're looking, and I'm from Toronto, so I apologize in this example, but the current Eglinton Crosstown LRT, my understanding is that Toronto Transit Commission will be doing the operational, because it has to integrate to the existing system. But there may be other projects where an operating component is important.
Well, I would maybe just ask Mr. Bartlett.
I think, again, it goes back to the design of the contracts that are involved, because one of the considerations around the ownership of these assets is that it's going to be, near monopoly sort of ownership of these assets. So given that's the fact, and the fact that private sector investors have an incentive to have, net revenues, risk-adjusted net revenues, as high as they can to increase their profitability, there is an incentive on their end to not only increase revenues through user fees and increasing user fees, but also drive down costs. And that may include deferred maintenance and that kind of thing. So it's one of those, it really comes down to how that contract is drafted at the end of the day, and what obligations the other owners of the asset have in regard to actually maintaining the asset over the long term.
I'm good.
Thank you all. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you all for being here. I want to start out with just a couple of comments in regards to, I think someone mentioned the conversation around infrastructure and the conversation we're having around the infrastructure bank. I think that the trouble is that when we're talking about infrastructure bank and the types of projects, we're talking about really unique type projects. We're not talking about the sidewalks, a park, these types of smaller community infrastructure needs that most people, most Canadians really think about. And so this kind of confusion or sometimes fear-mongering around privatization of all infrastructure in our communities, and that's really not what this is about, and that's why our government has also committed to infrastructure funding in traditional forms as well. But then the conversation happened and the examples were given of probably projects that didn't go very well. And it was associated with P3s. I come from the municipal background, and I can tell you completely government-funded government projects that also went horribly wrong, that also had tenders who were over budget, construction delays, employees not paid, municipality charged twice, illegal Chinese steel used, unqualified workers. Those examples actually exist currently, and the taxpayers are on the hook one way or the other. Court cases also happen. I know in my municipality, we had to go after people who didn't complete projects as they were supposed to. So I guess the problem I tend to have is that where is the correlation that only bad projects can happen or bad contractors can only exist in a P3 type system? Unfortunately, we can get bad contractors with fully government funds or in private partnerships. So that's kind of my comment, and I'm sure that some may want to speak on that, but because I have limited time, I want to throw that out there and then get to a question in regards to the infrastructure gap, something I'm somewhat interested in the sense that because we're not talking about every sidewalk, every park, every municipal need, how do you determine the gap when sometimes these projects, and we've heard a lot about transit, for example, sometimes there are needs municipalities don't necessarily know they have because they're too big to even contemplate when we would do 5, 10, 15-year budgets. It's something you'd like to have, but you've got to fix the local pool, or you have to repair a sidewalk, or you have to resurface a road. How do we come up with that gap when these types of transformational projects, some municipalities not even know what they need or where to begin at identifying it?
Sure. I would just say, first of all, that you're about to hear from Maddie Simatiki and Mark Romeff, and Maddie will give you all the answers you could possibly want. Sorry, Maddie, I'm putting you on the spot on P3 performance. The problem with the basis of an infrastructure gap is compared to a fantasy ideal world. I have a Porsche gap, I have a Ferrari gap, I have a Learjet gap. I love all those things.
Armani gap.
Armani gap. And that's the very fundamental basis of how most governments have defined infrastructure gaps. Getting a bank that's receiving proposals, unsolicited proposals, is a start where you can start getting private sector ingenuity to say, hey, there's a need here, we can provide this on a user fee basis. That's a great way to help address this with real dollars behind a proposal.
Yeah, if I could interject here. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there have been problems in all different types of projects, and there had been a problem with what they called optimism bias in the public sector. So it's not unique. I mean, the concern with these large private sector deals is that you also don't have that transparency. And there's also more opportunities for self-dealing, like we saw with the McGill Hospital in Montreal. A lot of corruption and fraud. We don't have the transparency behind that. In terms of the infrastructure gap, I mean, that's I've been involved with the FCM in terms of talking about that. Ben is right about that, and I think that that's why it's important to have some better national planning on this, and not just the value for money, but to try and figure out the cost benefit on these different projects in that way. So it's not just driven by that, but it's also not driven by unsolicited bids. I mean, those will be projects in which people want to profit from. So we've got the example in Montreal of the REM, which is was seen as a poster child for this, but there are real problems with it. It's not integrated. It's not integrated because they figure they're going to make more money out of it with the existing system. People are going to have to pay more. I am really concerned about increased user fees related to this. Some people think that it's a positive thing, but I think you really need to look at what's happened in Ontario and elsewhere and see how those user fees have really hurt members of middle-income groups, middle class, increase their costs, and they're rebelling against it. So it's a real warning thing down the road, and you should be concerned about it.
Cut you there, Mr. Sanger, and Mr. Elbouteyev and Mr. Greywall. We'll go with 3 minutes apiece. We could.
Well, thank you. I just want to get to the bottom line. I mean, what matters to me at the end of the day is the cost, and this is an area where there is investors coming to put their money. There's projects. We're in Canada. We have a great guarantee that we can give to any investor. So the risk taken on that isn't as high as can be in other countries. So it should be a phenomenal deal for whoever is going to invest in Canada's infrastructure, talking about our country and how healthy our base is. So the question to all of you, and I don't know who's going to start to answer, if we're to compare this type of investment cost to another types like 3Ps, what we'll be looking at in percentage-wise? Do you have any idea? Is there any clarity over how much that is going to be on the taxpayer at the end of the day?
We don't know how much is going to be on the taxpayer, but there's a lot of information out there on what returns are required to make for the private sector to be attracted to make these sort of investments by various infrastructure asset type. So you're looking at returns, average annual returns in the range of 10 to 15%. Before being adjusted for risk. Now, about half of that is a cash yield from the revenues generated, and half of it's the capital appreciation. But it's quite significant because of the fact that these are highly illiquid assets. Generally, it's very difficult to get out of these contracts. There's credit risk associated with it, political and regulatory risk, that kind of thing. So the private sector requires a great deal of compensation to get involved. And not only that, that is with regard to brownfield investment. This bank has looked to be dedicated toward greenfield investment. So these unique assets that have no history of an asset stream associated with it are going to require even higher levels of compensation in order to attract private sector investment because the risks are that much higher.
Any?
Randall knows, has worked on a number of different sides of this, and he's an expert on that. But certainly, I mean, those are the rates of return that we've expected to see from the private sector, and Michael Sabia and others have confirmed that that's the rate of return that they expect on this. And so, if you're expecting that type of risk over a 30-year project, I did a calculation in this report that shows that over a 30-year project that could cost close to twice as much as if it was funded at the Government of Canada long bond rate. So,
I just wanted to provide one example because it's really important. I've been in touch with various people in the U.S. right now, and the investors down there, if they're doing a transit project, because of the sharing economy, and I don't want to mention, but car sharing where people take passengers to stations, let's say, nobody is investing in parking structures right now. The risk is too great because we're entering a world in the next 15 to 20 years of autonomous vehicles, so those self-drive will take someone there. They won't need to park. So this is the kind of stuff that the private sector will probably be more attuned to. You guys are hearing it first. I mean, this is pretty new information, but none of the big investors in the U.S. are going to touch this stuff nowadays, and that's the kind of stuff you have to look at.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here today. At the end of the day, I come from a riding in which the growth is out at a pace the infrastructure can't keep up. So houses are being built, people are moving in, but the infrastructure trails it quite a bit in terms of schools, in terms of roads, in terms of public transit, which is most important. So the Infrastructure Bank will give an opportunity for the City of Brampton to apply to the bank for funding, especially because of our council's decision, we gave up $400 million in funding to fund a brand new LRT. So people in my area are applauding the Canada's Infrastructure Bank because we're going to be able to, at the end of the day, the government is going to be able to build better infrastructure. I used to be a corporate lawyer, and we did a lot of work on P3 projects, and they had their benefits and their disadvantages, which we've all heard a lot of. Can all of you, in your experience in the area, let me know of a P3 project that went bankrupt?
I'll start. There was a large Metronet one in the UK, and the UK government had to bail it out.
Sorry, in Canada.
In Canada, some people here in Ottawa, some of the first P3s here, the proponents just walked away from it, and the government had to pick it up. They didn't go bankrupt. One was backed by a UK firm, the other by the Senspex. They said after 3 years into the project of a 30-year project, they said we want more money because the revenue isn't there, and so the City of Ottawa kind of caved in and gave them more money. So there haven't been many bankruptcies, partly because I think that what happens is they say, we're going to need more money, but I think that there's a lot of money in it anyhow, partly because there isn't the demand risk. The problem here is that there will be that demand risk, the revenue risk with these infrastructure bank projects, and so there is higher possibility for it to be bankrupt. Most of the P3s in Canada are backstopped. They've got guaranteed availability payments from the government. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but most of them are guaranteed revenues there. So there's less possibility that they've gone bankrupt. Hamilton Water, I don't know if that went bankrupt, but certainly it was started by Enron, and so there are a number of different examples there.
Just very quickly, if you think about bankruptcies as a project failure, the other way to think of it is actually as a successful risk transfer to a private sector. So if all of our P3 projects made an attractive return, what that would mean is that we're overpaying for the transfer of risk. So a bankruptcy actually might be seen as a policy success.
Okay, thank you. I have one question, maybe two. Mr. Dashes, in your presentation on page 5, you really in effect are talking about this bill, and I think governance. And I guess my question is, do we, in order to get the proper governance that you're talking about, does the bill need to be amended, or is it more a process in terms of operations, in terms of how that infrastructure bank would operate, either by regulations or in terms of the policy of the bank, in terms of how it operates?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Does it need to be done in the legislation? Do you need to reform the legislation? Or are these the kind of institutional safeguards that you can create in the actual practice of the bank? A good example where this isn't necessarily baked into the legislation is with the Bank of Canada. If the Government of Finance decided to send a letter to the Government of the Bank of Canada saying you must set interest rates in a certain way, that would be like hitting the nuclear button. And that would be a pretty serious breach of public trust. The question that becomes, can you design the arrangement between the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Infrastructure, and this bank in a way outside of legislation that effectively creates that same sort of structure of making sure you have that political independence? And that's going to be the big question going forward for this committee to think about.
Okay, thank you. The other thing I had on infrastructure, you pretty near all agreed on the high-speed rail. But a concern I have, and probably the folks here from Alberta, anybody outside of central Canada has, is, a $5 billion project may be what you need in central Canada. well, $1.5 million project in my riding is as important to my economy as that big project is. I mean, we know an area in Alberta where the municipality is charging I forget what the fee is, $1, so much a head for cattle in order to take care of those bridges in that municipality, and it just can't be handled by the producers. So how do you, without some political involvement, everybody always wants to take the politicians out of it, but we have a responsibility to the country as a whole. How do you handle that? Mr. Manahan.
That's a really important question, but we do have, for example, current gas tax programs, Building Canada programs that are done on a criterion such as population or other criteria such as ridership for transit. I don't think the infrastructure agency that we're talking about should have a mandate to spread projects across the country based on population or, you know, making sure every province gets a project. That should not be the mandate. It should be the highest return on investment where the evaluation makes sense. And you know what? The high-speed rail may not even make sense in central Canada. That would still have to be looked at.
Okay, with that, Mr. Can, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add is I think that's one of the reasons why we're really advocating that future needs analysis, because as I said in my presentation, it needs to be mindful of the regional needs and variations. So really, if you want to have a really good understanding of the overall needs, I think you have to have a local bottom-up driven strategic needs analysis so it does reflect those regional needs and variations. And you want to look at the overall outcomes for Canadians as a whole, not just where the population center resides.
Okay, Mr. Sanger, final point.
I'd agree on that, and a point I'd like to make is that if you actually did have it publicly financed, a bank publicly financed with lower cost of financing, it's some of the smaller areas of the country that are facing a higher cost for borrowing that could benefit the most. And just in response to your previous question, I was a bit struck by what the finance minister said yesterday, saying that the projects would receive approval because that's not in the legislation as far as I read it. And so if there's that confusion over it, then definitely that this legislation should be separately worked out instead of rushed through in an omnibus bill.
Okay, thanks. With that, thank you all as witnesses for appearing. We will suspend and bring the next panel forward. Meeting suspended. Okay, could we get members to the table? We are going to be under a fairly tight time frame because when the bells ring, we've got no choice but to go, and there's 7 minutes left. So, again, as people know, we're meeting on Bill C-44, and we appreciate you coming to make your presentations. We'll start with you, Mr. McDonald, Senior Economist, National Office with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
Thank you very much, Mr. Easter, and thanks so much to the committee for their invitation today to speak on Bill C-44. With any budget implementation bill, there's always something interesting to say and plenty to say about it. Briefly, I would like to commend this committee and Bill C-44 for closing several of the boutique tax cuts that have been opened over previous years. I hope this committee will continue forward and tackle several of the larger and more regressive tax loopholes later on, like the stock option deduction or the capital gains inclusion rate. However, today I would like to focus my remarks on the proposed infrastructure bank. First, it's important to note that whatever the structure of the infrastructure bank, loans are a poor substitute for federal funding, and there has been a substantial shift in infrastructure investment and responsibility over the past century. In 1955, the federal government spent 35% of every infrastructure dollar. Today, it spends 15%. And it is municipalities who have picked up the slack. They used to spend a quarter of every infrastructure dollar in 1955. Now they spend close to half. Provincial contributions have remained roughly the same over this period. The federal government continues to pay the lowest interest rate of any level of government and enjoys the broadest tax base. Municipalities, on the other hand, face the highest interest rates and the smallest tax base. This cost shift leads to fewer dollars spent on infrastructure, and the costs that are shifted to this lower level of government are shifted to a level of government that are least able to pay them. Now, as I see it, the main functions of a properly constructed infrastructure bank are 1, to lower interest rates for municipalities, and 2, to facilitate the borrowing process. Smaller municipalities or municipalities unfamiliar with larger projects would particularly benefit from these functions. However, neither of these straightforward functions is part of the proposed functions listed in the infrastructure bank in Bill C-44. And municipalities do face higher interest costs than federal governments. So I looked up the bond rates this morning for the City of Ottawa, which pays 2.25% on 5-year bonds. Halton Region, just outside Toronto, pays 2.54% on 5-year bonds. And this would be compared to the federal interest rate for federal government bonds of 0.82% on 5-year bonds, roughly 1.5 percentage points lower than the cities. And as with a mortgage, higher interest rates means higher costs for cities and or higher user fees for Canadians. An infrastructure bank could effectively lower borrowing costs to close to the federal rate. For its part, the federal borrowing rate is close to a record low, given the incredible demand for federal government bonds. Put another way, investors are desperate for more federal bonds, thus driving up their price and driving down their yield. An infrastructure bank could take advantage of this and pass the savings on to cities. However, I'm concerned that as structured, the infrastructure bank would not achieve the goal of reducing borrowing costs for cities, but in fact it would do the exact opposite. The proposed infrastructure bank appears to serve the needs of investors, not those of cities. In fact, the input of any government is explicitly and oddly not necessary for accessing funds through the infrastructure bank. It appears that public-private partnerships, or P3s, and not low-cost financing will be the focus of the bank. The likely impact will be interest rates to cities of 7 to 9% on infrastructure bank projects, instead of 0.8%, the current federal borrowing rate. In other words, the proposed structure will increase interest costs by a factor of 10. As with a mortgage, substantially higher interest rates means higher interest rate payments over the life of the project, and those higher costs will be borne by governments or by higher user fees, or both. And municipalities are not blind to this issue, often preferring public financing due to lower costs as opposed to P3s. This is not a hypothetical problem. In 2014, the Ontario Auditor General examined the $26 billion worth of P3 projects undertaken by the Government of Ontario, an amount incidentally similar to what the Federal Infrastructure Bank is considering. She concluded that the P3 structure would add an additional $8 billion in costs over and above the $26 billion of the projects themselves, almost entirely due to higher interest rate costs, and these much higher costs would be borne by the Ontario government and ultimately by Ontarians, so that P3 consortiums can see higher profits. I'd encourage the committee to refocus the Infrastructure Bank on driving down interest rates for municipalities while accelerating their access to infrastructure loans. This refocusing of the bank's priorities on what cities need instead of what on investors' needs will best serve Canadians by keeping costs and user fees down while encouraging cities to use the bank due to its competitive rates. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. With the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, Mr. Ramoff, President and CEO.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chair and co-chairs and committee members for inviting me to appear here today. I'm pleased to speak before the committee on behalf of the Council, which is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan, member-based organization with broad representation from across all levels of government in Canada and the private sector. Its mission is to promote smart, innovative and modern approaches to infrastructure development and service delivery through public-private partnerships. The Council is a proponent of evidence-based public policy, educates stakeholders and the community on the economic and social benefits of public-private partnerships, and facilitates the adoption of international best practices to make sure that we continue to be very best at what we do. I should emphasize that the Council is not a lobby group. Rather, it works as a partner with governments to enable them to achieve the best outcomes and the best value for taxpayers from their respective infrastructure investments. The Council is pleased to speak today in support of Bill C-44, in particular the Act to establish the Canada Infrastructure Bank. I know committee members are well aware that irrespective of the size of Canada's infrastructure deficit, which some estimates peg at about $1 trillion, and the fiscal challenges all governments across the country face, continued investment in infrastructure is absolutely critical because it drives job creation, drives productivity, drives economic growth and prosperity, and drives global competitiveness. That's why the Council has supported long-term infrastructure programs by successive governments to tackle the infrastructure deficit in this country. Notable in this regard, of course, is the unprecedented and ambitious federal investment of $186 billion over the next 12 years. But we will be the first to say government cannot do this alone. Governments at every level do not have enough money or expertise to build the world-class infrastructure needed to grow Canada's economy and improve the social well-being of our citizens. That's why the establishment of the Canada Infrastructure Bank is such an attractive, innovative, and timely initiative. The bank's mission, as you know, is to deliver revenue-generating infrastructure by attracting private capital investors. The injection of private financing means government is in a position to make better use of public funding for a broader range of infrastructure projects, such as new water systems, social housing, recreation and cultural facilities, and on-reserve infrastructure. Mr. Chair, Canada has a strong record of success when partnering with the private sector. Engaging the private sector in the design, construction, finance, maintenance, and even the operation of critical public infrastructure is not a new idea in Canada. We have a long and successful history of public-private partnerships in this country. The Canadian model has delivered high-quality infrastructure built on time and on budget and demonstrating exceptional value for taxpayers, primarily because of the rigor and discipline the private sector brings to the procurement process. There are currently 258 P3s across Canada, and those facilities that are already in operation or under construction have a value of more than $122 billion and include a broad range of projects like hospitals and long-term health care facilities, roads, bridges, public transit, and water and wastewater treatment facilities. And it's important to stress these projects in every instance remain publicly owned and publicly controlled. This is in no way privatization of government assets. The Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis has independently estimated that P3s have saved Canadians as much as $27 billion over the 25 years that P3s have been in play. These projects have been demonstrated to being built 13% faster than those brought to market in the traditional way, which has added a further $11 billion in value to the Canadian economy. Most important, P3s are creating 115,000 jobs and generating $5 billion of additional wages on average every year. This strong track record of success has resulted in the Canadian P3 approach being recognized around the world as best in class. Over the years, Nanos research has shown that 7 out of 10 Canadians consistently support P3s and recognize the private sector is better equipped than government to deliver high-quality projects on time and on budget. The Canadian P3 experience is evidence that there is no shortage of private capital waiting to be invested in Canadian infrastructure, and that the private sector is willing and prepared to take on significant risk to support these projects. We have a funding problem in Canada, not a financing problem. We believe if structured appropriately, the Canada Infrastructure Bank can leverage public dollars further by transferring revenue risk, reducing overall public expenditures, while ensuring projects are delivered on time and on budget and are well maintained over the life cycle of the asset. And when I say structured properly, I mean each project that comes to the Infrastructure Bank must first and foremost have a strong business case, and the procurement process that follows must be competitive, efficient, transparent, and fair. It must also be recognized that not all governments have the capacity or expertise to successfully procure the large, complex, revenue-generating projects that will be the purview of the bank. In these instances, we would urge government to establish a project preparation fund, which would be available to less experienced provinces, territories, municipalities, and Indigenous communities in order to enable them to acquire the consulting services and advisors necessary to successfully take their projects to market. Mr. Chair, the Council sees the Canada Infrastructure Bank as another tool in the toolkit for governments to deliver more high-quality infrastructure for Canadians and greater economic stability for communities across the country. We believe the bank can draw in more private capital and build on the successful Canadian P3 model. We are the first to say that P3s are not a panacea, but when done for the right reasons and on the right projects, they deliver real results for Canadians. And now that the location of the bank has been decided, the important next steps are to recruit a high-quality and experienced chair, a board of directors, and a CEO who together will put the flesh on the bones of this new institution. Under strong, capable leadership, my council is confident that the Canada Infrastructure Bank will be well positioned to continue the country down this path of success, and the council is pleased to support the act that's being considered by this committee. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. As an individual, Mr. Simatieff. Simatiki.
Simatiki.
Stop, they're telling me, stop. We'll let you go with the name. I know
Sure.
now why the other gentleman called you Matty.
Sure. Yes. My name is Matty Simatiki. I'm Associate Professor of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. I've spent the last 15 years studying infrastructure with a specific focus on public-private partnerships. And over the last year, I've been delving into and examining this idea of an infrastructure bank. I've written 2 reports on the Infrastructure Bank, which go into some detail about the role and structure for this institution. And over the period that I've been studying the Infrastructure Bank, the role and notion of the bank has shifted from a low-cost financing to municipalities, and it's shifted to one of attracting private capital and investing in revenue-generating infrastructure. Now, in my studies, one of the questions that I keep returning to is what is the value of this bank? And when you read the public commentary and debate around the bank, there's this question of what is the public value? What is the benefit of proceeding with this type of institution? And in particular, what type of projects are going to be those that are invested in? So from my vantage point, let me spend a few minutes talking about those ideas, both the public value and what type of projects. I think the place to start is by understanding a few fundamentals of the infrastructure sector in Canada. The first point is that most infrastructure assets in key sectors that Canadians are concerned about and the government has prioritized do not generate, do not support their operating costs, let alone their capital costs through user fees. So that is public transit, that's most roads that have no tolls on them, that's many of our water systems, that is our affordable housing stock. Most of those assets do not cover their revenues through user fees, and that also includes via rail. So what that means then is that the bank is not going to be providing new money in those sectors. This is not additional money, because any money that is invested through the bank is going to have to be paid back somehow, and that's going to either have to come from user fees that don't exist on those asset classes, or it's going to have to come from some other government source. So with the exception of projects that generate user fees, this is not new additional money to expand the pie. This is a financing technique, not new funding. We have to be very clear about that. So we have to, if the bank is going to be focused on revenue generating projects, that narrows the scope of the type of projects that are really going to be viable and of interest. And keep in mind, we've been talking a lot about institutional investors. The reason institutional investors have not invested in Canada to a significant extent to date is because there's not the project deal flow. There's not the type of assets that they are interested in, which is very large projects, typically with a minimum value of $500 million and often up to $1 billion in value. They want very large projects that they can take an equity stake in. And to this point, those types of projects have not existed in Canada in large measure. The third point to raise is that actually the provinces and municipalities provide most of the infrastructure in Canada. So the Federal Infrastructure Bank is going to have to be a collaborative organization. It is not going to be just bringing forward projects on its own. It's going to have to work with both private investors, but also with the governments at the provincial and municipal levels who are ultimately responsible for, in many cases, approvals and operating and maintaining these assets. The fourth point is that there are existing institutions in the landscape, in the institutional landscape across the country that provide many of these services. There are provincial financing authorities, and there's a First Nations financing authority that already exists that provides low-cost financing to municipalities. And there's also public-private partnership agencies right across the country that provide expertise and support, keeping in mind that most of the public-private partnership projects in Canada are provincial, not federal projects. So we have to understand the institutional and governance overlaps and make sure that we're getting that collaboration right with this institution. And finally, as Mark mentioned, we have been using P3 models widely across the country. So we already have private capital at play and involved in infrastructure in Canada. So with that survey of the landscape, the question then is, what role can the infrastructure bank play? And from my vantage point, the infrastructure bank, the real opportunity is to go for unconventional projects that are innovative and of national significance. The real big projects, the game changers, the moonshots, the projects that are going to launch Canada in a different direction, and projects that are unconventional in the way that they are financed and paid for. This is not going to be and funded through user fees. This is not going to be for your typical road project or your typical transit project from my vantage point. This is going to be for projects that that are very large and long term. It's going to be for projects that often involve multiple partners, and so there's a risk and requirement to bring these partners together. It's going to have user fees from multiple sources, not just necessarily, or revenues from multiple sources, not just from user fees, but perhaps from a combination of sources that then together pay for both the capital and operating of the infrastructure. And finally, these are going to be high-risk projects, but that have potential that are high risk for all of the partners, both the private sector and potentially for the government, but then also have a potential for major rewards for all of the parties involved. I can just give you a few examples of the types of projects I'm thinking about to really zero in here. One project is waterfront regeneration, and we can think about a project like the Portlands redevelopment in Toronto. By investing in the flood protection of that area in the eastern part of the downtown of Toronto, we unlock billions of dollars in land redevelopment potential. Now, no investor is going to be able to come to the fore and invest in the flood protection, but they might become involved, and they will become involved in the real estate and the transportation and the business opportunities once that land is in place. So the bank could provide a role in catalyzing that type of development. Transit projects are another area where we could see the bundling of transportation and land use into the same type of deal. Typically, we've seen transportation and land use done separately. There's an opportunity to bring those together to generate revenues not only from the transit fares, but also from the redevelopment potential around the stations and potential rents that can be accrued from those developments. So there's these creative type of transit projects. Community hubs are an opportunity, another opportunity where we're bringing together multiple uses of land into areas where we can bring together public schools or recreation centers and try to fund and finance some of that through development. In our fast-growing communities, there's real opportunities to leverage development to pay for some of the infrastructure and build stronger and smarter communities. Green energy, there's an opportunity for waste and water, or there's an opportunity for district energy type of systems in some of these fast-growing areas. There was a project in Toronto that they were going to bring forward a district energy plant, and they just couldn't get the capital to put the project in place. It would have been paid for by the redevelopment of the land and the condo units over time, but they couldn't get the money together to pay for the upfront cost. And finally, social infrastructure. There are some incredible examples of projects that are bringing together uses that are very creative that you wouldn't think of. There's a project bringing together a condominium with a homeless shelter in the same building, using the condo revenue in part to pay for some of the land costs for that development. These are the type of opportunities I think the bank can play. I want to echo what everyone on this panel has said, which is that evidence-based planning has to be at the core of this. How do we prioritize and select between the different options, the different projects, because there's going to be a lot of calls on this revenue and on the money that's in the bank. How do we pay for it? The other point is that the bank is the center of excellence rule that's in the legislation that could be a real opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to the first three questioners, 5 minutes, and then we will see where we're at. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for your testimony. I want to talk about following up on the last speaker in terms of value. In my municipality, I have two in my riding, and next to Toronto, suburban, and then it goes further north and rural. But things like broadband, for example, are another major issue in terms of infrastructure. Transit, we've talked a lot about. But when it comes to value, Mr. McDonald, you spoke about something that was interesting in terms of, the potential increased costs. If you're looking at just interest rates, for example, or borrowing rates. My regional municipality had a AAA credit rating, so we could borrow relatively well. But I think about that, and because I have the municipal background, it's interesting because that's not how municipal governments think. Municipal governments tend to think, this is a project, this is an initiative we need, and I'll use broadband as a perfect example, because we know that if we can implement this, the possibilities are endless in terms of growth. And if any of our municipalities had to pay for it, the term that my council used to always say, 100-cent dollars, it would be out of question. But even at a higher interest rate, but if it was paid for with partners, and we would have 25-cent dollars, 50-cent dollars, then that made it much more doable. And in the end, the project might have had a higher interest rate, but we weren't alone paying for it. And because there is only one taxpayer, if I went to the taxpayers of my community and they said, if you want this project and we don't have an infrastructure bank, you'll have a lower interest rate, but you're paying 100% of the cost. Or through private investments, the overall project might have a higher interest rate, but you as a taxpayer is actually paying less and you don't have all of the risk. You know, that is part of the value that I can see on the grand scheme of things in the price tag, but it's adding partners and kind of sharing that risk and sharing the cost to make something transformational happen. This isn't, you know, a sidewalk project, a park, etc. So I have limited time, so I'll kind of leave it at that and then see if there are your thoughts and if you have difference of opinion on that.
You raised broadband, which I think is an excellent example. You may be aware that in the case of the Northwest Territories, through a P3 project, fiber is being laid right up the Mackenzie Valley, and that's a project, as I say, went to market as a public-private partnership, and the intent there, of course, is to connect all the remote communities. There is another project underway right now in Manitoba, which is bringing 57 First Nations communities together. Again, a broadband project aimed at connecting those communities. I think that these are individual projects that are moving ahead as P3s, lots of interest by private sector in financing those initiatives and bringing them to fruition. What would be interesting in the case of the Canada Infrastructure Bank is if they went ahead with a national broadband strategy and really took the potential of these smaller projects global. Because Canada, as you may know, used to be a leader in broadband, has tumbled quite a ways down now. And I think if we're serious about playing at a world standard of 5G or bigger, we need to put in place the infrastructure to make it happen. So you've raised what I think is a really interesting initiative, and I'll make just one other point. We at the Council have been promoting what we're calling a dig once policy. And by that, what we mean is that every time the government puts a shovel in the ground for particularly major projects, they should capitalize on that opportunity and lay fiber right then and there in order to ensure that we can get our gigabyte capacity up. It's a rounding error in cost relative to the main act that's taking place.
Donald.
Well, I think that, I mean, there's nothing stopping municipalities from getting additional partners to come together on projects. I mean, the real question is what role or help does the Infrastructure Bank play in that or not? If the Infrastructure Bank forces you into a project with a 10% interest rate instead of providing you with an interest rate of 1%, well, that'll make a huge difference for whoever is finally paying the cost, whether that's the taxpayer, whether it's a ratepayer, whether it's a user fee payer, whether it's a municipal government. There's a huge interest rate differential, and that makes, particularly on longer term projects, the longer the project, the more interest rate costs you're incurring. And so I would see the role of the Federal Infrastructure Bank as how can you get the best interest rate deal for municipalities such that they pay the lowest possible rate, as opposed to forcing them into structures where they pay, in essence, the highest possible rate because of the P3 structure, excuse me.
Patty, go ahead.
Yeah, my question in this is, what's the ultimate funding source for it? Not the financing of where the money up front is going to come from, but the ultimate long-term funding. Keeping in mind that these projects are going to have ongoing operating and maintenance costs that have to be covered, and if the broadband's not being provided today, it's probably because it's viewed by some to be uneconomical. So there is going to have to be a subsidy from someone. Is the Infrastructure Bank going to be an agency that provides long-term subsidies, or is that going to come from a provincial government or a municipal government, or are there other ways of structuring the deal? That's going to be the types of questions that determine whether that type of project is viable.
Thank you all. Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Romoff, in the 25 years of the existence of P3s in Canada, has there been, or has it been very rare, that government would be a financial partner in the P3 consortium?
If you're talking about financing, the intent is not for the government to be a financing partner. We're talking about projects where the private sector is taking on responsibility for some of that financing through private sources. And that's critical to the project because they have skin in the game. And so you can be sure they're going to make sure that all the obligations under the contract are met, and that timelines and outcome specifications are also met, because there are penalties at play.
The benefit here to the public part of the P3 partnership is that you don't necessarily bear all the costs up front. It's spread out over 25, 30 years, whatever it is. Whereas the infrastructure bank, I'm not going to call it a bank because I don't think it's a bank. It's the infrastructure entity, is really by putting $35 billion into that entity, there is a strong likelihood that that the taxpayer will become a public partner in some of these projects going forward, because as Matty, and I'm going to have to call you Matty, rightly pointed out, these are the big gambles that you're going to be deciding whether you take a political gamble or not. And so you are gambling with public money in the infrastructure agency concept versus the P3, where there frankly isn't a gamble. It's a set-out contract and pay for it over 25 years. Matty, would that be a fair way of assessing the differential?
I would actually see them as different models on a continuum. So you can think of project delivery being on a continuum from greater public sector responsibility to greater private sector responsibility. Traditional build sits at the public end, and full privatization sits at the private end. P3 and the varying degrees of P3 are somewhere in the middle. This is moving closer to the private sector end of the spectrum, and so I think what we're going to see then is really in what ways are the deals structured and where is the funding coming from. It's not just about the financing. It's really about it's the funding sources that underpin these type of projects and what role the government is going to play in them.
But the funding, ongoing funding, is something that happens through many current P3 models. But what I'm hearing you say is that the likelihood of the new entity is going to be going towards projects that probably wouldn't get off the ground under the traditional model because they're a bigger risk.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think these are going to be the projects that really push the boundaries, but have the potential for very high rewards. In the P3 models that we've seen in Canada, the goal is really in the P3 is to optimize private finance, not maximize private finance, because private finance is expensive. The reason you use private finance is to lock in the risk transfer mechanism. In the infrastructure bank model, we're moving to a different approach. We're actually trying to raise new capital through projects that can bring in new revenue sources to then drive, to increase the size of the pie. And so that is a different approach that's being conceived here.
I'm good.
Thank you, Mr. Leipert. Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To all witnesses, the infrastructure bank itself is going to require staffing, advertising, maintenance. Should that be shared amongst the private sector? Or should we also include our lowering borrowing costs of what we bring to the table to these? Because our lower borrowing costs is certainly a very, very important part of the entire picture and of good value assets. So start with Mr. McDonald. Should the infrastructure bank itself be borne entirely as an expense to the taxpayers? Or should it be something 50-50 or some type of a structure? And then what do we count then as we're going into the arrangement with the important asset of a lowering borrowing cost that nobody else can get? Is that worth something to consider for the overall costs for taxpayers to pay for the infrastructure bank itself?
I think that maybe we'll see. There's probably broad agreement that the infrastructure bank should be borne by the infrastructure borrowers at the end of the day. It's a real question of this committee, I think, as to whether this bank's goal is to reduce interest rates is to use the position of the federal government's low interest rate in order to reduce the costs for the cities that are going to use this money, or is it a vehicle for investors to get the 7 or 9% that they need to pay back their returns on the pension plans that they require? And so it could go either way. I mean, this is a decision of this committee. At present, none of the functions as listed in Bill C-44 state that the goal of the bank is to produce rock bottom interest rates for municipalities. That is not, interest rates are not discussed in the functions of the bank. And so the investors and the needs of the investors are what are discussed in the function of the bank.
Mr. Roma, and then we'll...
Thank you. I see this arrangement similar to the establishment of any Crown corporation. So from the perspective of who pays for the day-to-day operating costs of the entity, if that's your question, I think that belongs with government because it is a Crown corporation. The key with respect to the mandate and the types of projects and the work it will be that it will do is clearly a function, as I mentioned earlier, of choosing the right chair of the board and the right CEO, because they are going to be the ones who are going to take a concept which is still in a state of evolution and really bring it to fruition.
And just before your answer, I'm going to ask one last quick question so you can return back again. In terms of the profit returns now in the P3s, the profit returns, are they generally being done by, are they going to Canadians or Canadian companies, or the profit returns from P3s exiting the country to other foreign investors? So both questions to you, and then back if to provide the proper time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so on your first point, we already have institutions whose role it is at the provincial level to lower borrowing costs. It's 6 or 7 provinces already have municipal borrowing corporations, and they recover at least some of their costs by charging a small premium on their borrowing to the municipal government that takes the borrowing on. So we already have those type of institutions. The key to keep in mind at the municipal level is their problem is not finding access to capital. The world is awash in capital, and there are people who want to take even municipal bonds. The problem with our municipalities is they don't have the money to pay it back. When they take on extra borrowing that raises their annual costs, they don't have the capacity within their tax load to pay it back. So, the infrastructure bank then, as another low-cost lender, might bring down the costs marginally, but that's not going to change the game for these municipalities, especially who are already facing very tight budgets. Now, on your question about where the money from P3s is going, P3s have been in Canada have been global in terms of who invests in them. They've attracted Canadian financiers, but also debt and equity investors from around the world. So the money is spreading widely.
And then Mr. McDonald.
Maddie's absolutely correct. The competitive process that is a hallmark of P3s in Canada has in fact resulted in all the global players converging on Canada, because this is where the market and the pipeline of projects has been. And increasingly, with any major project in Canada, the consortia that bid these projects are international by definition. Good Canadian components, but lots of international players. So in the end, there'll be that sharing of revenue. One thing I would also say is with respect to...
Mark, if I could get Mr. McDonald to
Sure.
answer that question, and then we have to move on because we've got bells going.
I'm good.
Yeah, there's no necessary relationship between P3s being located in Canada and the investors being in Canada. Certainly the PPIB, with the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, is one of the big investors in P3s in Canada, but they're just as likely to be located in tax havens, for instance. Or one of the interesting new trends that the infrastructure may well accelerate is the tranching of P3s, such that it's not one company or one consortium that's responsible after about 5 years for the financing of P3s, but instead the P3 is sliced up into 10 or 20 pieces that themselves are sold off individually, such that a single P3 could have 10, 20, 30 owners, investment funds from around the world, such that those profits are not returning to Canada by any stretch.
Thank you very much. As colleagues, you can see we've got bells, and so we'll have to be done in about 8 minutes. So, Mr. Fergus, if you could do some questioning in about 3 minutes.
Is it only 15-minute bells?
Pardon?
Is it only
15-minute bells, yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Alors, juste une question à nos invités aujourd'hui.
I just have a few questions for our witnesses today. First of all, Mr. Simiatiki, you said that the only contribution that the bank is going to give to this debate is that investors will have the opportunity to go forward with viable projects. Not necessarily right now because they don't have a source of revenue, but perhaps they will be able to get money to develop lands for a project. For example, if you look at public transit, it's not the investment that we're really looking at here. It's really the development of lands around the stations. Did I understand you correctly?
Opportunity for transit would be to link transportation and land use much more closely. When we look internationally at cities like Hong Kong or Singapore or cities in Japan, where they've really benefited is by linking the development of new public transit in particular with the developments around those stations. And what that allows you to do is drive traffic on the system, so you get fares, and then it also raises the revenue for from the development. And so what we're really seeing, I think this provides an opportunity to drive better city building. I think if we're really optimistic about this, we can see the bank bringing together multiple partners to build complementary uses and build and actually drive both revenue and better city building. And I think that's the opportunity that we're looking at here.
I would simply add that what we're talking about here is a concept known as land value capture. And increasingly around the world we see projects, particularly transit projects, they tend to be subway projects, that lend themselves to capturing that land value at stations along the way. And that is all about community building for sure, but equally important, it's a revenue generator for governments at all levels. So there is an opportunity here to be far more creative, far more innovative in the way in which we deliver on infrastructure, and it's another way, aside from simply user fees, where we're generating revenues that will benefit levels of government.
Go ahead, one more quick one.
I assume this also attracts new investment. So these are new dollars which would come into the system, into public investment, public infrastructure investment. It's not displaced dollars.
That's the key. If you have new revenue sources, whether they're development revenue sources or whether they're user fees on the asset itself or other types of revenues that come from sources other than government, that is additional money and that is potentially increasing the size of the pie. It's those type of projects I think the bank is going to look at. In cases where that is not, where the revenue source is, where it's not a user fee, then that's a financing strategy. That's like paying on your Visa. You still have to have the money to pay back your Visa bill. It has to come from somewhere.
Mr. McDonald?
I agree with Maddie's comments. I don't think I can add anything further.
Take four quick questions. Mr. Albutea first, then Mr. Ouellette, then Mr. Deltel, then Mr. Sabara. Mr. Albutea.
Well, thank you. Just a short question. Why do we need infrastructure bank? To all of you.
I'm happy to go first.
Sure.
The rationale that we would offer for the bank and why we think we need it is because it can be a vehicle which will bring projects that would not normally come to market. And by that I mean that they may be projects, Maddie referred to a couple a bit earlier, that just don't or have a risk attached to them that wouldn't normally attract the private sector. So the bank, through the various vehicles it'll have available to it, can in fact de-risk that project to a degree where it becomes attractive to the international investment community, and that will result in, first and foremost, more projects coming out because of the bank, but also free up government funds for them to invest in other projects. So from our perspective, it's a win-win.
I think one of its primary goals could be to lower borrowing costs, although Maddie's certainly right that there are provincial authorities that do that to some degree already. I think one of the real downsides is that if its goal is not to reduce borrowing costs, it could in fact substantially increase borrowing costs and long-term costs for user fees or for municipalities that are the end users of these infrastructure assets.
I think in the bill, there's a notion of a center of excellence around infrastructure and data collection, and I think we shouldn't downplay how important that is. We need to get smarter in how we pick projects and then how we learn from our experiences and take them forward. I think those have the real potential to drive long-term benefit in a context where we're going to be spending tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars on infrastructure over the next decade.
Mr. Ouellette.
Now you've intrigued me. I wanted to actually ask a question about Indigenous potential projects in Indigenous communities, but I actually want to talk about the the data collection. So how are we not actually collecting data appropriately? Or have we been successful over the last decade, 2 decades with PPPs?
As an academic, I ask myself that all the time. Myself and my students are desperate for information to provide the real evidence of how these projects are performing, both in the PPP space, but also in the traditional space. How do they compare? What are the comparable experiences in terms of cost overruns, in terms of asset maintenance? We hear a lot of numbers and a lot of contentions about how these projects are performing. We have actually very little data, real hard data in this country to be able to undertake those assessments. I think the bank could help us understand the impact of the procurement models and the impact of the type of projects we're selecting, and also the impact of the different contractors. Can we learn about which contractors are performing well and under what circumstances so that we can deliver infrastructure better into the future? I think that's the potential that the data collection portion of the bank has, and I think that shouldn't be downplayed. I think that's really significant.
Mr. McDonald?
One of the interesting things about gathering more data would be actually to compare traditional versus P3 models on similar projects to see which ones perform better over the long term in terms of costs and completion rates and so on. And an infrastructure bank like this could do that. I mean, it's very much skewed towards the P3 side, but it could also offer traditional financing at very low rates. And it'd be interesting to see in the real world, not retrospectively, how those projects perform against one another.
Or you could even compare looking at, just a completely public versus the PPPs versus the infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's exactly the situation that we have with respect to the 4 ring road projects in Alberta, because 3 of those went ahead as P3s and 1 went ahead as traditional procurement. If we had the full data on those projects, we have an in situ opportunity there to really come up with the kinds of analysis that all of us are so keenly interested in. But it's remarkable how limited the data collection is on the part of governments right across the country with respect to traditional procurement. We're a bit better on the P3 front because it gets so much scrutiny, and so much of the information around value for money and other things are put on the websites of the procurement agencies, but there is no equivalent information for traditional projects.
Last comment, Mr. McDonald, and keep it short. We're down to
4 minutes.
I
mean, I would actually disagree. In terms of the private contracts that the P3s are putting together, those private contracts are private, and so therefore the transparency becomes a huge issue in terms of trying to evaluate them after the fact.
Sorry to have had to rush you gentlemen, but I think there was some great information come out of that session. With that, we will have to run to a vote. We thank you for your presentation and your interest, and we will adjourn. No, we're done.
Oh, you moved all the